This is the story of how a 12-year-old became the youngest person in modern American history to risk being sentenced to death for a crime that might have been an innocent mistake. The evening started like any other. It was July 28, 1999, and Kathleen Gross at Tate was doing a favor for a friend. Kathleen worked as a Florida Highway Patrol trooper, a respected officer with years of service. Her friend, Dewey's Paul, needed someone to watch her daughter Tiffany for the evening. Kathleen agreed without hesitation. Tiffany arrived at the Tate home that evening, a small girl with a sweet personality. She knew Lionel from previous visits. The two had played together before. There was no reason to think this night would be any different. Kathleen was upstairs working on her computer while the children played downstairs. She could hear the television, hear the sounds of the kids moving around. Everything seemed normal. She checked on them periodically, as any responsible adult would. The children seemed fine, playing and keeping themselves entertained. Lionel was a big kid for his age. He was heavy, weighing around 170 pounds, and he was strong. Tiffany, by contrast, was tiny. She weighed only 48 pounds, a small girl even for 6 years old. The size difference between them was enormous. Downstairs, Lionel was watching professional wrestling on television. This was 1999, the peak of wrestling's popularity in America. Shows like WE Raw and SmackDown dominated ratings. Kids everywhere were mimicking their favorite wrestlers, practicing moves in their backyards and living rooms. Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Triple H, these were the heroes of the era. Lionel loved wrestling so much, and that night, he decided to practice some of those moves with Tiffany. What happened next remains disputed to this day. According to Lionel's account, he was just playing. He was demonstrating wrestling moves, pretending to be a professional wrestler. He didn't mean to hurt anyone. It was supposed to be fun, just like on TV. But professional wrestling, even though it's choreographed, is performed by trained athletes who know how to make moves look devastating while minimizing actual harm. They practice for years. They learn how to fall, how to take hits, how to protect themselves and their opponents. A 12-year-old boy, no matter how much he watched on television, didn't have that training. And a 6-year-old girl certainly didn't know how to protect herself. Sometime around 10 p.m., Kathleen came downstairs. What she saw would haunt her forever. Tiffany was lying on the floor, motionless. Her body was limp. She wasn't responding. Kathleen rushed to her side, her training as a law enforcement officer kicking in immediately. She checked for a pulse, checked for breathing. The little girl's condition was critical. Kathleen called 911. The call came in at 10:02 p.m. Paramedics were dispatched immediately to the home on Southwest 62nd Terrace. While they waited for help to arrive, Kathleen tried to perform CPR, tried to do anything she could to revive the child. Lionel stood nearby watching. He was scared, confused about what had happened. He kept saying they were just playing, just wrestling like on TV. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics rushed into the house and took over from Kathleen. They examined Tiffany quickly, their faces grave. The injuries they saw were extensive. This wasn't a simple accident. This wasn't a child who had fallen and bumped her head. Tiffany was rushed to the hospital, sirens blaring through the quiet Florida neighborhood. Doctors at the emergency room worked to stabilize her, but the damage was too severe. The little girl had suffered massive head trauma. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. She had a lacerated liver, broken ribs. Cuts and bruises covered her small body. At 11:15 p.m., approximately 1 hour after the 911 call, Tiffany Eunick was pronounced dead. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy would later testify that Tiffany's injuries were among the worst he'd ever seen. The damage to her body was consistent with someone who had fallen from a multi-story building or been in a high-speed car crash. These were not injuries from simple roughhousing. These were not injuries from children playing too hard. The question that would dominate the next 2 years was simple but terrible. What really happened in that living room? Broward County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Tate home shortly after the ambulance left. They began their investigation, interviewing Kathleen and Lionel, examining the scene, documenting everything. Lionel's story was consistent. He said he had been practicing wrestling moves. He said they were just playing. He demonstrated some of the moves for the officers: a body slam, a leg drop, various holds and throws. He seemed genuinely confused about why Tiffany was hurt so badly. On TV, wrestlers did these moves all the time and stood right back up. But investigators were skeptical. The injuries didn't match up with a simple game gone wrong. The medical examiner's report painted a picture of sustained, severe violence. Tiffany had been beaten badly. The fractures to her skull suggested multiple impacts. The damage to her internal organs suggested tremendous force. Detectives interviewed Kathleen extensively. She maintained that she had been upstairs, that she had checked on the children periodically, that everything had seemed fine until she came down and found Tiffany unconscious. She believed her son's story that they were wrestling. But prosecutors saw something different. They saw a child who had died from brutal injuries. They saw a mother who had left 2 children alone, unsupervised, for an extended period. And they saw a 12-year-old boy whose story didn't match the physical evidence. As the investigation continued, more details emerged. Neighbors reported that they had heard loud noises from the Tate house that evening. Thumping sounds, banging, the kind of sounds that might come from a child being thrown against furniture or walls. The prosecution would later argue that what happened wasn't wrestling at all. It was a beating. They theorized that Lionel had attacked Tiffany in a fit of rage, possibly because she wouldn't cooperate with the games he wanted to play, possibly for reasons no one would ever fully understand. The injuries were too severe, too numerous, too systematic to be explained by simple horseplay. 3 weeks after Tiffany's death, on August 19, 1999, Lionel Tate was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was 12 years old. The case immediately became national news. A 12-year-old charged with first-degree murder. A 6-year-old girl dead from injuries her playmate allegedly inflicted. A mother who was both a law enforcement officer and the parent of the accused. The story had every element that media outlets craved. But beyond the headlines, there were serious legal questions. Should a 12-year-old be tried as an adult? Could a child that young even understand the concept of murder? Was it fair to hold a child to the same standard as a grown adult? The prosecutor, Ken Padowitz, was determined to try Lionel as an adult. Under Florida law, prosecutors had discretion to charge juveniles as adults in serious cases. Padowitz argued that the severity of Tiffany's injuries and the circumstances of her death warranted adult charges. This wasn't a tragic accident, he contended. This was murder. Lionel's defense attorney faced an uphill battle. The evidence was damning. Before the trial began, prosecutors offered a plea deal. Lionel could plead guilty to second-degree murder and serve 3 years in a juvenile facility, followed by 10 years of probation. It was a generous offer considering the charges. Many legal experts advised taking it. But Kathleen Tate refused. She believed her son's story. She believed this was a tragic accident, not a murder. She wanted to fight the charges, wanted a jury to hear the full story and vindicate her son. She rejected the plea deal. It was a decision that would have devastating consequences. The trial began in January 2001. Lionel was now 13 years old, but he had been 12 at the time of Tiffany's death. He sat at the defense table, looking small despite his size, looking very much like the child he was. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They called the medical examiner, who testified in graphic detail about Tiffany's injuries. 35 distinct injuries covering her body, a fractured skull, lacerated liver, broken ribs, bruises from head to toe. He stated unequivocally that these injuries could not have resulted from wrestling play. They required significant force, repeatedly applied. They called experts who testified that professional wrestling moves, when done improperly by untrained people, can indeed be dangerous. But the injuries Tiffany sustained went far beyond what any wrestling move could explain. The defense argued that Lionel was just a child who didn't understand his own strength. They presented him as a boy who loved wrestling, who was imitating his heroes, who never intended to hurt anyone. They emphasized his age, his lack of criminal history, his remorse over what happened. On March 9, 2001, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Lionel showed little emotion when the verdict was read. His mother collapsed in tears. In the gallery, Tiffany's family members held each other, crying with relief that someone was being held accountable for their loss. Under Florida law at the time, first-degree murder could be death sentence. People feared for the little boy. Was he just going to go in death row at the age of 12? 2 weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, the judge formally imposed the sentence. Life without parole. It was terrible for a child but better than death. Lionel Tate, at 13 years old, became the youngest person in modern American history to receive such a sentence. The judge acknowledged the difficulty of the case. Kathleen Grossa Tate left the courthouse devastated. Her son would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would never go to high school, never learn to drive, never have a career or a family. He would grow old behind bars if he survived prison at all. Tiffany's mother, Dewey's Paul, told reporters that while she was glad someone was held accountable, she took no joy in seeing a child sentenced to life. She said the whole situation was a tragedy, that 2 children's lives had been destroyed that night. The case sparked immediate national debate. Civil rights organizations argued that sentencing a child to life without parole was cruel and unusual punishment. Child development experts testified that 12-year-olds lacked the brain development necessary to fully understand consequences or control impulses. How could society justify throwing away a child's entire life for a crime committed before puberty? Lionel's attorneys immediately started filing appeals. They argued multiple grounds for overturning the conviction. They said Lionel hadn't been mentally competent to stand trial. They said his attorneys hadn't properly defended him. They said the sentence violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The appeals process took years. While it proceeded through the courts, Lionel sat in prison. He was housed in a juvenile facility initially, separated from adult prisoners due to his age. He attended classes, participated in programs, and waited for the courts to decide his fate. In 2004, 3 years after his conviction, Florida's 4th District Court of Appeal made a stunning decision. They overturned Lionel's conviction. The appeals court found that Lionel had not been given adequate mental health evaluation before trial. His competency to stand trial had never been properly assessed. Under Florida law, a defendant must be able to understand the charges against them and assist in their own defense. The court ruled that because Lionel was so young and because his mental state had never been properly evaluated, his conviction couldn't stand. The decision didn't mean Lionel was innocent. It meant he deserved a new trial, one where his competency would be properly assessed first. Prosecutors faced a choice. They could retry Lionel, now 17 years old, for murder. Or they could offer another plea deal. This time Lionel's family accepted the deal. In 2004, Lionel pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to time served plus 10 years of probation. Having already spent 3 years in custody, he was released. Lionel Tate walked out of prison at 17 years old. He had spent his teenage years behind bars for a crime he committed at 12. The world he stepped back into was vastly different from the one he'd left. Freedom, however, didn't last long for Lionel Tate. In May 2005, just months after his release, Lionel was arrested for violating his probation. He had been caught with a knife and was accused of threatening someone. The violation was serious enough that prosecutors sought to revoke his probation entirely. Then, in 2006, came an even more serious charge. Lionel was arrested for armed robbery. According to police, he and an accomplice had robbed a pizza delivery man at gunpoint. Lionel was now 19 years old, and this time there would be no sympathy for his youth. He was convicted of armed robbery and sentenced to 30 years in prison. The young man who had once been called a victim of an overzealous justice system was now clearly making his own choices as an adult. The public sympathy that had surrounded his case evaporated. Even advocates who had fought for his release had to acknowledge that Lionel seemed unable to stay out of trouble. Lionel Tate's story didn't end with redemption. It ended with more crime, more victims, more years behind bars. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.